I want to thank you all so much for being here. We have 170 people registered. I'm really excited for the enthusiasm, just so grateful for you all to be here. Our report is titled Voices of the Movement Toward an Equitable Farm Animal Protection Movement. I am so grateful to have some really special guests here from the Builders Initiative, Faunalytics, the equity-based Dialogue for Inclusion, and Mercy for Animals. So you'll hear from each of them. Please feel free to chat over your questions in real time. And Amy and myself will distill them and we'll ask them at the end. So don't feel the need to wait, but please just feel free to use the chat box as we go. So I guess I'll just start us off by saying that I envisioned a report like this at the same time as I was envisioning what Encompass could be. Before Encompass even had a name, I knew that I wanted to engage in a research project to understand what racial equity and inequity looks like in the farm animal protection movement. And we all are working against some of the most powerful, deep-rooted industries on the planet, animal agriculture in all its forms. And at the same time, we know that we will never create the food system or world that we envision for animals if we fail to confront oppression against humans in animal agriculture and in our own movement. And so you know, without being intentional about bringing in and retaining Black, Indigenous people of the global majority with all our skills, passion, brilliance, we will simply fail to achieve our mission. And so with that, I wanted to understand this in kind of a research-based way, because for me, it's very intuitive. I think for many by PGM, it's very intuitive, but we also know that we do need to make the case a lot. And we need to kind of highlight and explain how this has historically looked, and we want to find solutions after going through an analysis and going through an understanding of where our movement is at now, creating a benchmark for future success. So as a result of this extensive research process, which took pretty much all of 2021, the EBDI team, Equity-Based Dialogue for Inclusion, developed 7 recommendations for Encompass, and we're going to use that to benchmark future success and measure progress. So they put their recommendations into 3 buckets. One is acknowledgement, one is reconciliation, and one is action. And EBDI will speak more to this in just a bit, but first, I wanted to introduce Walter from the Builders Initiative, who was one of our funders for this research report. The Builders Initiative invests in and collaborates with nonprofits, businesses, and others working to create more sustainable solutions for societal environmental challenges, and they recognize how animal agriculture fits into that. And so Walter is the Senior Associate Program Officer. In his role, he works to support the farm animal movement and rural arts programs. And in my few interactions, I can see how much of a systems thinker he is. He really is interested in transforming the food system to center the well-being of farmed animals. And so I just want to pass it over to Walter and say thank you for funding this report and for caring so much about this issue, and love to hear just a little bit from you about why this is important.
Yeah, thank you so much. And hi, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here among friends and many folks that I get to share my work with every day. And it is great to be here for the launch of this report. I am Walter Abrego. I am the Senior Associate Program Officer with Builders Initiative based in Chicago. And I want to start by lifting up a quote from the report. The authors wrote, and I quote, "Making progress on racial equity in the farm animal protection movement is not only a moral imperative, but a survival imperative for the ongoing and continued success of the movement." Over the last year, I had the opportunity to join the farm animal protection movement in my current capacity, and I have talked to many people in the movement. The findings of this report validate the experience I had, and for many good and reasons for us to improve. As a funder in this movement, I take this report as a call to action, to do better and to move through this world with deep reflection on how we show up in the movement and how I personally show up in the movement. Going forward, this report calls us all to be more diligent in the way in which we work every day, and calls us to move through our work with a deep analysis of power and influence. This report calls us to think beyond our current metrics of success and audiences that we have traditionally reached, and to think of a future of an animal protection movement that is not for the few, but for the many. Actions from all of us are needed to change the current trajectory of the movement, to move us to a path of healing and equity. But I think what I found most exciting about this report than anything else is what it gave me. It gave me a lot of hope and optimism. Hope and optimism that a lot of people in this movement are trying to do their best. They're trying to do work that is really deep and thinking critically about how we better the lives of animals, as well as the fellow humans that we share this world with, and the fellow humans that we share this movement with. So with all of that, it is a pleasure for me to have been able to fund part of this report through Encompass, and to recognize Encompass for the work that they're doing for the entire movement, to make us, to set us in the path for success, and to really solve this survival imperative of we need racial equity as part of our movement if we want to be successful in the future. So it is a pleasure for all of us at Builders to be here and to have been invited to this. And it is a pleasure for me to see this work happening in our movement as we get better and better every year. And with that, I'll pass it over to our host.
That was brilliant. Oh my gosh, one of the lines you said gave me chills. Thank you so much, Walter. I so appreciate you stating that, especially as a funder and from that lens. I think that's so important, because so much of what I hear is, well, I don't know how funders feel about this, and this feels like an add-on. And so just having your voice in this is just especially meaningful for me. So thank you so much for joining. I'd love to hand it over now to Joe Anderson, who's the research director at Faunalytics. As most of you know, Faunalytics works to empower animal advocates with access to research, analysis strategies, and messages to maximize effectiveness and reduce animal suffering. Joe in particular is a rock star, has many years of experience with a wide range of social science research methods and topics, has advanced training in statistical analysis, just like major. I wish I had 1/4 of that kind of ability, and has been the research director since 2017, leading and supervising studies on behaviors around animals and veganism, advocate retention, funder decision-making, and many other topics that I think our movement really benefits from. So in addition to that, Joe has served as a co-leader for the Research to End the Consumption of Animal Products, is a research advisor to ProVeg, Animal Charity Evaluators, Animal Advocacy Research Fund, and is also adjunct research professor at Carleton University in Canada. So in addition to all of that, she's got a PhD in social psychology, has done a 2-year postdoc at Cornell. Like, just listen to everything she has to say. So I'll hand it over to Joe. Thank you so much for being here, Joe, and for supporting our research on the back end with a lot of pro bono support.
Thank you so much, Ariana. Thank you for having me as a part of this research and for that lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to it. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about why research in general is important to the movement, and research like this in particular. And the reason is right here in this room, virtual room right now, is that animal advocates like us are just as varied as the non-human animals we represent. Some of us started because we were driven by passion and compassion for those non-human animals. And others started out by looking at the world at large, all the problems that we have, and just it's overwhelming. They start off by trying to think of the way that they can have the biggest impact. And they end up at animals because it is a way that they can have a large impact on a large number of lives. But regardless of which of those paths or another one you start with, we all sort of meet in the middle of wanting to make as big a difference for animals as we can. And research, in my view, is exactly what helps us find that balance between passion and compassion and wanting to make a large impact. So if you rely too much on the passion side, you end up overweighting your own point of view to the exclusion of others. You can think too much of memorable experiences that are rare, but they stick in your mind because of how memorable they were. Or you can just think that this thing that was so important to me was obviously therefore the most important and best way of doing things. But on the flip side, if you go too much down the path of making the largest impact possible, and it becomes a numbers game for you, you end up focusing on the best approach to the exclusion of looking at a variety of approaches. And that by definition will end up perpetuating what works for the current majority in a movement, what continues the status quo, essentially. So between those two things, there is a middle ground where we can do both and find parallels between what everyone wants, and research like what Encompass has done here and EBDI is making us stronger as a movement. We don't know before we do research like this what we don't know. Some people have one set of knowledge, others have different knowledge, and the only way that we can bring all of that together is by getting a range of voices, like in this report, and a range of voices that are asking the questions. So we can learn more and we can do more for animals just by having that wide range of perspectives, a diversity of voices. And that's why I am so excited to see this report come to life finally, and to have been just a small part of it in my advisory capacity. I think it's such an important step for human justice and animal justice alike, and it's so very needed. So thank you for having me today, and back over to Arianish.
Thank you, thank you. So I'd love to now hand it over to EBDI, the Equity-Based Dialogue for Inclusion. They are a Black and Latinx owned consultancy offering a wide range of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice services. I want to remind folks that we would love to have questions. So please feel free to use the chat box, and as they're speaking, just feel free to utilize that, and Amy and I will distill it and answer questions at the end. So I'd love to introduce Ahmmad. As the only child of disabled parents, including a mother who grew up in the pre-civil rights American South, Ahmmad has grown up sensitive to issues of equity. And as a young child, Ahmad's family moved from Oakland to a suburb of California's Central Valley, and then later Sacramento, for access to stronger performing public schools. And so this really helped give him firsthand experience of how race and class intersect, how the school system participates in this, all the different intersections, and how that influences access to opportunity. So Ahmmad has been amazing, has gotten a new post at Northwestern University. He will speak to EBDI broadly, and then Ande, who is a sociologist and works in the technology industry as a user experience researcher for Adobe, really led the research process, a lot of the writing, and is a team member at EBDI. So having a foot in both the technology sector and academia has really put Ande in conversation with privilege, equity, and help frame her understanding of what change looks like. So with that, I would love to hand it over to both of them, and they'll speak a little bit about how they came to this, how they came to the findings themselves, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much, Arianish. It's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Arianish, as well for making this happen, right? And, I want to start just a little bit by giving you some context for EBDI, the organization that my co-founder and I, Jessica Oliveira, my co-founder, and I, we started in 2020, right? So we're a relatively new organization. And then, after sharing a bit about EBDI, I'm going to pass it to Ande, who, as Arianish mentioned, really did all of the heavy lifting for the report. But there are a couple of things that are really important about EBDI's report and methodology, I should say, for the context of what we're saying in the report. And the first thing is that my co-founder and I, we started EBDI with an emphasis on dialogue, narrative, and storytelling, right? And we did this for a couple of reasons, right? The first being that we just have personal interest in these areas. My co-founder, again, Jessica Oliveira, she's, among other things, a community organizer, but also a writer. Right. So really interested in narrative and storytelling. In my own academic research, I'm a social scientist by training. I use mostly qualitative methods. And a lot of that is building comfort, right, with the people that I'm speaking to in interview or focus group context, getting them to be able to share, right, oftentimes around difficult topics, especially given that so much of my research focuses on inequality, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right. So all that said, that's sort of the history and background of EBDI in terms of our orientation. But what's really important, and this is what I want to emphasize, is that when we think about DEI work, and frequently and most often we work with organizations, right? Not movements. We work with organizations with equity assessments, facilitating intergroup dialogue, that kind of thing. Fundamentally, when we do an equity assessment, if we're particularly trying to understand the experiences of BIPGM, there often isn't a large enough N, right? There isn't a large enough number of them for us to make really robust statistical claims, right? Certainly not anything that would pass, pass the basic tests of peer review, for example, in the academic space, right? So almost by definition, in most predominantly white institutions, organizational settings, you almost can't do an equity assessment, right? A true equity assessment unless you get in and speak to people, understand their experiences, understand their stories, right? So that's the lens by which we led with this report. And, but the last thing that I'll say before passing it over to Ande to share about all the wonderful research that she did is that, when we started EBDI, one of my personal sort of academic muses, if you will, is a researcher, a sociologist by the name of Donald Tomascovich Devi. If you're interested, he sort of built in a long lineage of research in, organizational context and equality context to develop something called relational inequality theory. And among other things, the big emphasis is that organizations are the primary mechanism by which inequality proliferates, right, in modern 21st century society. And when we say organizations, we mean very formal organizational context. I mention this because the heart of EBDI and what we do, we obviously have, hopes and aspirations for each of our client engagements, but our broader theory of change, if you will, is that if we take that proposition, at face value and sort of invert it in some way and say, well, if organizations are a primary mechanism for inequality or the proliferation of inequality, why can't it be a mechanism for the proliferation of equality, or to take it even further, equity, right? So that's really the spirit in which we engage at EBDI with our clients and our client partners, as we call them. And so when Arianish reached out to us, when Michelle, who formerly was at Encompass, Michelle Rojas Soto, who was formerly at Encompass, reached out to us, I was just so excited about the opportunity, because rather than working with a single organization, right, we're able to work at a movement level, which frankly is a lot more leverage than trying to change one organization at a time. So all that said, very excited to be here today. Thank you, Arianish, and everyone at Encompass for making this all possible. And I'll pass it over to Ande.
Great, thanks, Ahmmad. And I'll just pile on my thanks to everyone for letting us be here and share this. And if you were part of this research, thank you, because we wouldn't have this report if people hadn't shared sort of their experiences in such a candid way. So Ahmmad touched a little bit about our orientation, and Joe talked about the importance of research, and Walter talked about the importance of funding this kind of research. I'll tell you a little bit about what we did. It is in the report, but I think sometimes hearing it this way can be a little easier to digest than reading a report. So for us, it was important to capture the realities of racial inequities in the movement and get sort of a lay of the land. And as Ahmmad touched on, multiple organizations existing as part of this movement is a different kind of engagement. And as sociologists, I feel we're especially well poised to sort of make sense of what it means to have multiple organizations in a structure together interacting. And so, of course, we still had to put a scope on it. Well, we did have a long time to engage, which was great. You can't do everything. So we did ultimately end up focusing on US-based organizations and mainstream organizations, which are the white-led, well-funded organizations that are sort of dominant in the farm animal protection movement. However, we did hear from everyone who wanted to share with us, particularly in the survey. And so our approach was to send out a survey that captured all sorts of dynamics and responses and people's understanding of inequities across all sorts of different social axes in the movement. And then also to solicit interviews both with leaders in the movement, funders in the movement, and also staff and volunteers in the movement. And so the idea is we get this really kind of multi-layered look at what's going on, and looked at the survey and got kind of a broad sense of what's going on in the dynamics. And then talking to leaders, talking to staff, talking to funders, you can kind of layer on what are the dynamics at play, what are the parameters of this, and what's the scope. And so, in the end, we had a lot of data and a lot of of different information that was really helpful. And so the way that we went about coding it was you read through the transcripts and you highlight and look for themes, and you start to kind of categorize those themes. And you will see in the online appendix kind of a list of the dominant themes that came up across all interviews if you are interested. And then from those, it's kind of going back through and rereading and noticing trends that sort of bubble up. And those key themes are what became the early recommendations that turned into the FAPM recommendations we make in the report. And of course, there's, you're always iterating, refining. So going back, talking through, talking to both Joe and Arianish about sort of how these fit and really kind of refining them. And that's how we ended up with the 7 recommendations we make. And then in the report, you'll see that they're written up. There's some context for where they came from, some kind of takeaways about what they mean, and then some supporting quotes taken both from the survey and interviews to sort of show a little bit of like, where did this data come from? And so that's a pretty typical qualitative process. And what's really exciting about it is that it really is across the movement and across these different layers. And, I just want to acknowledge that as outsiders to the movement, I think we were especially well poised to sort of notice dynamics that for people already in the movement might seem sort of familiar and regular, but to us as outsiders, we're able to see them in sort of a different light. But of course, we couldn't have that understanding if people hadn't opened up their worlds and their perspectives to us. So for that, we're grateful. And I do also want to acknowledge that as a white woman with class privilege, of course, while I worked very hard to create sort of a safe space in interviews where people can share, and as Ahmmad said, sort of open up and share their lives. And I'm trained to do that. I don't exist in a vacuum, and I'm perceived as I'm perceived in the world, and that may have shaped responses. So, it's important to acknowledge that we're all social actors in that way. And I don't want to take up too much more time. So if you have any questions about the methodology or anything, I look forward to seeing the question in the chat. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ande. And just really quickly before passing it back to Arianish, I just want to emphasize, and we say this in our concluding thoughts of the report, this is, I'm not going to say it's the beginning, right? Because there have been plenty of you in this call, right? Arianish, included, of course, Encompass included, and others with whom we've worked on this report, who have been leading this work, for a while. And I'm sure they have predecessors as well, right, that they can point to. But, we say this with all of our client partners, and that, the DEIJ work that you're all going to be embarking and have been doing, it's a process, right? And it's not the beginning, but this is part of the process. This is a step in the process. So I just want to highlight that because I'm so excited as with all of our client partners, but particularly for this engagement, so excited for what's to come, future inquiries, future growth, right? And just to also, I say this also just to pay respect, right? To the people who have done so much, not just in this movement, but more broadly in relation to equity, inclusion, justice, right? This is a centuries old fight, right? And, I always just keep that in mind when we do this work, because you're not going to solve it overnight, but this is an important step in the process. And again, we feel so privileged, to have been a part of this. So thanks again.
Thank you. It's been such a journey. I really appreciate you reminding us of the folks who have worked to get us to this point and the people who will continue to do this work after we're no longer. And so it really takes a very big team, and that's what a movement is. So with that, I'd love to hand it over to Leah Garcés. Most of you know that Leah is the president of Mercy for Animals. She's on the advisory council of Encompass, has been such a supporter of mine and this work. And I really am so grateful to all that she does. And as you all know, Mercy for Animals and Leah in particular have worked with some of the largest food companies. The goal is to, really end factory farming. And with Leah's 20 years of leadership experience in the animal protection movement, we're so grateful to have her here today. So I'd love to hand it over to Leah.
Oh, thank you so much. I read the report, but now I'm even more impressed hearing firsthand from everyone involved what it took to get here, the year of work that it took, and the incredibly intelligent folks involved. So I first want to just commend you all on this work, and Arianish for your vision. in seeing this gap in the movement and our need for it. It's just brilliant and so incredibly needed and useful. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, as was just said, I'm the president of Mercy for Animals, and we are working to end animal agriculture and create a compassionate food system. So that's a big idea. And I was asked to speak today or comment a little bit on why a report like this, why research like this is important to an organization like Mercy for Animals and a leader such as myself. So I'll start off by saying that MFA's newest core value that we just added to our 3-year strategic plan is equity. And in fact, a lot of organizations are now making equity this kind of central part of their work. But for me, as I've had the question about 1 million times now, what does this mean? Like, how do we do this? From the board to individual staffers, just saying, okay, equity, I hear that's a buzzword now. What does it actually mean? And what does it mean for us as an organization? What does it look like? How do we do it? We all are in favor, but how do we achieve it? Or what does that look like? So essentially what people are asking is, how do we move from performative to a meaningful way of, expressing equity in the organization? And I think that the report, which I so enjoyed and found so smart, dug directly into the movement to find that out. And I love qualitative research. I'm a qualitative research junkie. And I love when qualitative research then, also has some numbers in it too, because I like little numbers, but I love the qualitative research that was done in it. And it really asks folks about their experiences with equity. And as was pointed out, it's a small sample size in our movement. So we have to really create those qualitative questions are really important to finding that out. And we have to take the time to do that. And this report did that. And it collected those experiences. And from that data, created these amazing, pretty actionable recommendations that helps us go from performative to meaningful. And I can't tell you how useful that is in this sort of sea of information about equity and inclusion and diversity that exists right now. This is, to my knowledge, the only research that looks specifically at the farmed animal movement in such a comprehensive way. So it's so valuable to myself as a leader. And we are hiring a DEIJ manager, our first, and this will be their roadmap. This will be the place where you say, okay, you need to read this first, and this is our roadmap. So you've provided a roadmap for the entire movement through this piece. I wanted to point out, right now equity isn't an option. Everyone needs to be working to it. It's critical, as the report points out, to widen the movement and to progress our objectives, our collective objectives. And there's two. I wanted to go through. I could have spent an hour going through each recommendation. So I'm only going to pull out maybe 2 of them that I thought, just to speak the reality of what this means. But I think one of the most interesting findings for me was pointing out that grassroots and community approaches is more likely to be used by PGM-led organizations where they work to support both human and non-human animal causes. And this is certainly what we found. And some of you may know, we have the People's Fund led by Jamie Berger, which specifically is a fund created for Black vegan activists. And indeed, the grant requests that are mostly coming through are for grassroots and community-based approaches, which frankly have been underserved in this movement. And if we weren't specifically creating a fund like this and looking specifically to serve and fund Black activists, I don't think it would have come to our attention that this was the need. This was where the work was happening. And in fact, in the past, I think that as the report mentions, we've been told that's the wrong approach to helping farmed animals. But actually, in ignoring that, we've been hindering the efficacy of the movement itself. And the report talks about reaffirming. It reaffirms to me that we're starting to move in the right direction, to keep going. It was kind of like saying, that you have all these doubts in your mind, and it's no, keep going. That's the way we get to more equity. And I think that it's really helpful that to point out that historically we've had this false dichotomy about this, and to keep going. One more thing I'll just point out is that it was also very helpful to hear recommendations that we need to recognize human exploitation in animal agriculture and the opportunities to collaborate. It's something I'm super passionate about. But again, you have like the historical movement hasn't seen that as effective. It's seen it maybe as diluting efforts. And so to see that this actually is a really effective way, to call it effective, to talk about efficacy in this way is groundbreaking, I think, and necessary to have louder voices that say this and say it more often, and just reaffirms the direction that we want to go in. And Walter already said this quote. I wanted to end with this quote too, but I'm going to say it again because it's so good. Making progress on racial equity in the farm animal protection movement is not only a moral imperative, but a survival imperative for the ongoing and continued success of the movement. So thank you for these learnings and the work that is a service to the entire movement, to farmed animals, and to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. It's so helpful to have your perspective on how this impacts how you think about your work at MFA, the role of our movement. MFA, of course, is one of the largest groups in this space. And so, hearing from you in particular is really helpful. So with that, I want to say that we have about a little over 10 minutes for questions. We have received some questions in the chat, so I'm just going to go ahead and read them out, and Amy will help me in some chat responses. So someone asked, does Encompass or EBDI offer any online or virtual racial equity trainings or courses? And if not, do you have recommendations for one? Ahmmad, I'll hand it over to you first, and then I can respond.
Yes, thank you for that question. And EBDI, I'll speak for our company, EBDI itself. We kind of have three broad things that we do, right? One of them is research, white paper, report writing, that kind of thing, which is what this work is. But the core of our work really is getting in and working with organizations. So we do equity assessments, as we call them, that focus on race, or take a broader aperture, right, around equity, depending on what the needs of our potential partners. We do a lot of learning and integration work. So my co-founder, who's not with us today, but Jessica, she leads our learning and integration work. I mention that all to say that this is something that EBDI does, but I'm not trying to push EBDI on you. In the online appendix, we have a couple of other providers that are that either EBDI or Encompass has relationships with, that we suggest, particularly for the facilitation of intergroup dialogue. There are also other organizations that I feel very comfortable recommending. Some of them overlap with the organizations that are listed in the online appendix, but there are other organizations as well that I feel very comfortable recommending to do this kind of work. And one of my missions, if you will, as kind of a scholar practitioner in this space, is to help organizations understand that there's so many different kinds of DEIJ work, right? Like, there's, you come in, you do an equity assessment or a racial equity or culture assessment. That's one type of work. Dialogue facilitation is another kind of work. Some of the workshops, one-off workshops, trainings, that's another kind of work. And that's all to say that, I'm happy to have an initial conversation, with anyone, to sort of fine tune exactly what it is that you're looking for, right? Because depending on that, I would have, and I think any solid practitioner in this space would have different recommendations, because, we kind of have our niche. Another organization has their niche, right? And we want to make sure we pinpoint and tailor exactly what we're doing to support you and what you're looking for. So before this is over, I'll put my email in the chat, and feel free to reach out. If I may take a day or two to get back, but I'm always happy to speak with anyone who wants to do this work in earnest.
Yeah, so as we mentioned in the chat, there are additional resources. One group that really focuses on trainings that I really like is the Interaction Institute for Social Change. And they have, I want to say, almost every month or every other month trainings. They're really great. So Amy will share the chat there, share in the chat. And then we also have a 3-part series Encompass is going to, that focuses on bringing racial equity to life in the farm animal movement. There'll be one every quarter 1, 2, and 3, I want to say. So I'd say sign up for our newsletter so you can learn more about that, but they're going to be shorter, between 1 and like 3 hour long trainings that build upon each other. So highly recommend that. And then more resources in the chat, so feel free just to check that out. So another question we got is how will Encompass be doing this same report, but maybe slightly adapted in the future to see how the movement makes progress over time? So that's definitely one of the core reasons for creating this report, is that I really do want to create something that we can better understand where we are now, and then we can benchmark for future success. In an ideal world, and you'll see one of the recommendations is around starting to ask organizations to create more quantitative methods for obtaining research internally. And I was hoping to get a better sense of, you know, where our racial representation is right now in the movement, but because organizations don't obtain that kind of data, we just couldn't answer that question. So we focused more on the equity and the sense experience, and I think that actually is more important, but I would really like to use this report to help us better understand also what we should be asking and looking for over the course of time. And Encompass is going to be creating a membership program that will help organizations better understand to better operationalize equity. As Leah was saying, you know, this question of equity sounds great, but what does that look like? And so we're at Encompass going to be helping set kind of the floor of what organizations should be doing to make racial equity come to life. And we just hired a program director who I'm really excited about, who you all will, I'm sure, be meeting over the course of time to make that, lift that up off the ground. So I'm really excited for that. And I would love to do a similar, slightly adapted report in like 3 to 5 years and see, you know, where we're at. I think that we need to really move forward, and hopefully this will help organizations better understand what to do and the imperative for doing it. Okay, I'm getting a lot of questions here. So another question is, although it's essential for institutional change to occur to make our movement equitable, institutions rely upon support from members and donors. I've seen a lot of pushback on social media when I've seen mainstream organizations share anti-racist posts. How do we educate white members of the movement so institutions can receive more support from their members in this work? I'd love to ask Ande if maybe she can speak to that, and then Leah, especially since MFA has such a big social media presence. Any thoughts that you've had organizationally would be really interested to hear that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this was a recurring theme of a lot of folks talking just about this pushback. And I want to make sure we're not conflating sort of the big donors with the small donors. And I think there's two dynamics happening. So there's like the large organizations that are funders, and then there's many small donors. And I think different organizations I spoke to took different approaches to this, where some of them are saying, if I lose a bunch of small donors for doing the right thing, then at this point I am willing to do that. So I think there will be a shift in tactics, and that sort of comes down to individual organizations. So I'm eager to hear what Leah says about that. But I think you know, one of our recommendations does sort of point to the larger donors, and it talks about the efficacy, to keep coming back to this word, of approaching this work, this farmed animal protection work, with a racial equity lens, and how that is sort of the direction that things are going, and that it is efficacious. And for what it's worth, the donors I spoke to understand that, right? So it's not, I was not seeing that pushback in my conversations with them. I think what I was experiencing was a lot of collective will, and really it's about the organizations needing to kind of move together and understand where this is going together. I think there's a lot of will for that. So that answers one piece of what's going on with the donors. And I think as far as educating others, I hope this report is one piece of that puzzle, where it does show that there is efficacy in approaching racial equity work. You know, I think that it's not a zero-sum game, where there is, it's possible to care about animals and humans and race, and it all can move in the same direction together. And hopefully this report starts to show that. And I know we're close to time, so Leah, I want to make sure you have a moment.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to comment on this. Certainly, we may be one of those mainstream organizations that you've seen that we post an anti-racist statement, and then it becomes the most commented on, post we've ever done, and there's a giant argument happening between folks, and then we have to like shut down the arguments because they get racist and they get out of hand pretty quickly. And we've learned a lot in the last 2 years about our role in those discussions. So I'll say we take different approaches. Sometimes when we make statements that we feel are just the statements we want to make and are not open for comment, we actually close comments down. We don't allow that to be a space where people are going to decide to share, racist views or white supremacist views, or we don't allow comments. And so we shut down comments for certain posts. And we learned that because it just became so overwhelming, the comments, and it just consumed too much time and resources. The second thing that we started to do is we saw it as an opportunity to bring supporters with us. We realized, and this was through working with Breeze Harper, that's the kind of need to educate, to bring supporters with us. So a supporter might have come in because they really cared about baby pigs, and then suddenly we're talking about racism, and they're like, I don't understand, like, how is this even related? And sometimes it's coming from a true place of like, did this organization just become a different one? And we went from like A to Z without leaving any breadcrumbs. So we started to think of videos that could leave breadcrumbs to help people make the connection. So we did a series on anti-racism and veganism. I think there were 6 videos. You may be able to find them still, to kind of bring people. We tried to leave the breadcrumbs basically, and why this was important to widening the movement and efficacy. Yeah, and I think it is very different, and that's with really our general supporter base. But with the big donors, that's a conversation. That's a bigger conversation, a longer conversation about efficacy, about widening the movement and having impact. And I do think there is an element of, Andy, what you said, where there is a little bit of, you may have to lose people, and people say, I'm not giving to you anymore. And you have to understand that they're in that space that is created from somebody leaving is a space for somebody to come and move towards the organization you're trying to become, the wider, more inclusive, equitable organization you're trying to create.
Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge something that Paul Gorski said, who's also on the Encompass Advisory Council and a major just force of nature, that the animal advocacy movement could also gain donors if we focused more. And what are we losing by not focusing on our interconnections? And I think that's a really important point. So encourage you to read his comment in the chat. I do want to close here. We're just at time. There were several questions we weren't able to get to. I'm sorry for that, but I hope that you will continue to stay engaged with our work. Hopefully some of the questions will be clarified in the research report. Amy, maybe you can share one more time the link. But I just want to say thank you all so much for joining. We had such a great number of people who have expressed interest in this, and thank you all to our speakers. And I'm so very grateful. So